Good afternoon, everybody. So we're gonna start the session, but before we kick it off, I'm gonna give some Zoom reminders. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So if you experience any Zoom technical issues, please call 1-888-799-9666 and choose option 2. Your audio will be streamed through your speakers, and you can submit questions anytime during the webinar in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And this webinar will be recorded, and that recording along with the slides will be posted on our website at thefdp.org. So now I'm going to pass it off to one of the FDP co-chairs, Michelle Masucci.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle Masucci, and I'm the Vice President for Research at Temple University, and as Sarah said, co-chair of the Federal Demonstration Partnership. Welcome to today's FDP webinar on Digital Persistent Identifiers. To put this in context for all of you, and I'm sure you know this, but it bears repeating, in January, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy released a report called Guidance for Implementing National Security Presidential Memorandum 33, better known as NSPM 33, focused on national security strategy for the U.S. Government-supported research and development programs. The guidance I'll post in the webinar, along with some of the things that FDP has already been doing in the past 3 months. One aspect of the guidance is to develop a digital persistent identifier, or better known as DPI, for investigators that would function as an investigator profile across agencies. Today's session aims to explain DPIs for researchers and how they are an important part of the researcher's workflow. It builds, as I mentioned before, on work that we've already been engaging at the Federal Demonstration Partnership, including an orientation to the guidance that was done in January during our triannual meetings by Jim Luther and Pamela Webb, who is on today's session helping us to moderate the Q&A. And more recently, she and Jim Luther put together a presentation that was provided to federal key stakeholders during their listening sessions to be able to help give an understanding of what some of the areas that remain in terms of questions around the guidance itself as we move towards implementation. I'll put links to all of those references for you in the chat so that you can have them at your fingertips. Without any further delay, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Lori Schultz, who is the Assistant Vice President for Research Intelligence at the University of Arizona, who has been integral at the FDP of working on this issue, building on work she had been doing around key investigator clearinghouse prior to this, and obviously with many other roles that she plays, I think as being one of the foremost knowledgeable people in this space. So she will introduce the panel, and I turn it over to you, Lori, to get us started.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate it. Can I get the next slide, please? I'm going to go through the agenda really quickly and then introduce our panelists. So we're going to talk a little bit about more context about the NSPM really quickly for the context of kind of how we got here today, how DPIs support disclosure, an intro to ORCID, and what it really means, ORCID for researchers and for university administrators, and really what your next steps can be as we explore this space and the DPIs become a way that researchers can enter disclosure information in a way that reuses the data we already have about them over and over again. Next slide, please. So Michelle already introduced me. Joining me on this panel is Chris Shillum, the Executive Director of ORCID, and Shauna Sadler, who's the Engagement Manager for Outreach and Partnerships at ORCID. And so I will start off with the NSPM conversation, and they will talk about ORCID. And please feel free to put questions in the Q&A. Pamela Webb is here helping us moderate questions. Thank you, Pamela. And next slide, please. My quick disclosure is that, just so you're all aware, I joined the ORCID Board of Directors in January of this year, 2022. Next slide, please. So jumping right in, none of these things are new to many of you. We've all seen the articles of faculty members and the way that engagement has happened around the China initiative and what has happened to faculty members at many of our campuses in terms of disclosure, overlapping of federal funding or federal effort, and other things that have happened around this issue over the past few years. So the way that foreign influence manifests, next slide, please. So you know the articles, you've seen the stories, but the way it really manifests is there are a few things that are happening that lead to those articles and those cases that we're seeing in the news on a fairly regular basis. That is in violating the confidential peer review process, and that can be both for publications and proposal applications. Taking that information, that IP from the US, and in some cases, filing patents for that technology outside the US ahead of the time that a researcher in the US at your institution, for instance, would be able to file a patent for their technology. And also things like appointments and affiliations with other organizations that duplicate US federal funding or effort and that aren't disclosed. So in the course of a proposal application, if those things are not disclosed, it may not be possible for them to uncover that there is some effort overlap or funding overlap that US federal agencies will want to avoid when they have the right information in front of them. Next slide, please. So this topic for us has been an issue for the research community and the FDP community for a number of years now. And I thought I'd walk through the timeline as a way to sort of get to where we are today with the January 2020 implementation guidance from the OSTP. So most of us remember that in August 2018, many grantee institutions received letters from the NIH alerting them to the NIH's concerns about violating policies requiring grantees to report their foreign ties. In May through September of 2019, so after that, the National Science and Technology Council that's overseen by the OSTP launched the Joint Committee on Research Environments, or JCOR, in May. And then OSTP started sending letters to our academic organizations and grantees to really start the conversations with our senior leadership in research about this topic. Then in December of 2019, it is December, I should have changed the slide, the NDAA was signed. And the National Defense Authorization Act includes oversight of foreign influence in academia and requires the Director of National Intelligence to submit a report to Congress around these issues and their impact of national security. So these things are not going away. This chain has led us to things like, in June of 2020, the OSTP came out with principles about enhancing the security integrity of America's research enterprise. In August of that year, the NSTC asked that working group to come up with the OSTP implementation guidance after the release of the National Security Presidential Memo in January of 2021. So we're in 2021 now. And so where we are today is that report, the implementation guidance that came out in early January, is the implementation guidance for the agencies, which offers the way that this will be implemented, their deadlines for completing certain actions, including things like the model application form. So all of this is stuff that you're very familiar with if you've been in this space and seen some of the overviews of this topic at the FDP and other places. Next slide, please. The OSTP guidance includes 5 key sections. Today, obviously, we're talking about number 2, which is digital persistent identifiers. But it also includes information around its disclosure requirements and standardization. So that's things like biosketches and current and pending support forms or other support forms, depending on which agency you're applying to. It also includes information about the creation of model application forms to harmonize disclosure requirements across agencies. And that 120-day deadline I referenced earlier is when we expect to see potentially something like a prototype for that form, so that we understand what they mean by harmonized form and what that may look like in the context of the forms we're already used to filling out for the NIH, the NSF, Department of Energy, and others. At a high level, what needs to be disclosed are things like organizational affiliations and employment, positions and appointments, foreign government-sponsored talent recruitment programs, and support. So current support, pending support, and in-kind support. Can we go back one more slide? I'm not quite done there. Or thank you. The other sections in there are around consequences for disclosure, a violation of disclosure requirements. information sharing between the federal agencies when there is a violation, and then information about a coming requirement for research security, which includes programs for cybersecurity training, export control training, things like international travel policies, and policies for taking electronic devices outside the country. And a lot of those things I know we will be learning more about as the year passes. And I anticipate the FDP and others will have more information as we know more about what constructing a research security program could look like on your campus. Next slide, please. Well, we're here today to talk about DPIs. And directly inside of section 2 of the OSTP guidance is the piece that references DPIs. And we'll talk about what some of the requirements of a DPI are as listed in the implementation guidance. What's highlighted in this slide are the really big ones. So the guidance indicates that the federal agencies should adopt DPIs to ease reporting and compliance and to reduce administrative burden. Some of the requirements around a DPI as spelled out in the guidance is that the DPI would disambiguate one researcher from another. So if you have researchers on your campus or in the field throughout the world that have the same name, the DPI can say that it's John Smith in physics at Arizona, not John Smith's in physics at Yale, for instance. That the researcher controls the content of their record. So they have a DPI, they are the one who controls the information that is in their record or profile. The DPI is free to researchers, and it enables interoperability between systems, basically meaning the data that's in that record can be used in other ways, like populating disclosure forms, or this model form that is required to be created by the guidance. So it would allow that data to be exchanged and not retyped over and over and over again as part of a way of reducing burden. The good news here is that ORCID is the organization that meets the DPI provider criteria as listed in the guidance. And ORCID is the only one. With that, I will turn it over to Chris to talk more about ORCID and what DPIs are. And thanks, Chris.
Great, thanks so much, Laurie. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon and great to see so many of you on the call. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with ORCID, but in case you're not, Shauna, next slide. I'll just give you a little bit of a background and then talk about the service we provide to researchers, and then hand over to my colleague Shauna, who will talk a little bit more about how ORCID is embedded into the scholarly communications ecosystem and how we support many stakeholder member organizations around the world. So we're an independent not-for-profit organization. We're open to participation by all. And our service was launched in 2012. So the ORCID registry, as we call it, has been live for just about 10 years now. We are sustained by fees from our member organizations. So as Laurie said, individual researchers never pay to make use of ORCID. We kindly rely on the support of around 1,200 members around the world, among them research institutions, funders, government policymakers, publishers, service providers, to enable us to do the work that we do. We're guided by a set of both values and principles that our first board, way back 10 years ago, established, which are very important, I think, in building and maintaining the trust of the broad scholarly community. And we are governed by a board of directors elected from our membership. As Laurie mentioned, she joined our board this year in the election from last year. So next slide. So we essentially do three things. We provide an ORCID ID, which is a unique persistent identifier, which is free of charge to any researcher. In the scholarly infrastructure community, we tend to call these PIDs, persistent IDs. The NSPM 33 guidance has coined the acronym DPI, means the same thing as far as we're concerned. But in addition to the identifiers, we provide an ORCID record. You can think of that as a profile or a digital CV, which enables the researcher to connect their identity, their ORCID ID, with metadata about their contribution to scholarship, whether that's employment, educational qualifications, research outputs, funding awards, etc. And last but not least, we want that data to be reused as much as possible in order to save the researcher from the burden of constantly rekeying that data. So we provide a set of application programming interfaces, APIs, that enable thousands of systems across the scholarly communication ecosystem to connect with ORCID and both make use of that data and in some cases contribute to that data. So next slide, please. So here's an example ORCID record, if you haven't seen one, from our fictional researcher, Sofia Maria Hernandez Garcia. And at some point in her career, she's come to ORCID.org, the ORCID registry, and obtained an ORCID ID. That's that unique identifier with the zeros at the start in the top left-hand corner of the screenshot there. And then over time, she's either added herself information about her employment, educational qualifications, her publications, etc., or she has granted permission to organizations and systems that she trusts in order to update that information automatically. And obviously that's what we like to see, because it's much easier for researchers just to have this data flowing into their ORCID records than them having to add it manually. Next slide, please. So why would a researcher want to do this? Well, the initial problem that we started trying to solve in ORCID is essentially to enable researchers to distinguish themselves from other researchers who might have the same or similar sounding names, and also to collect all of their contributions that may have been published or have metadata associated with them with name variants. And you know, both problems are huge issues. Many people have the same name. There's a lot of inconsistency among different publications and other places where metadata is published in name formats. So the ORCID ID enables that problem to be solved by unambiguously allowing the researcher to associate themselves with all of their contributions. But you know, over the past 10 years, we've identified a number of other benefits for researchers. Obviously, many researchers change their name through the course of their career, often due to family changes, getting married. Increasingly, this is something that's important to transgender researchers. So again, because there's a unique identifier for the ORCID, the name can be changed by the researcher at any time. They can add all of their various name variants to their record. You know, above all, I think that we hear from researchers that they hate admin, they hate providing the same data to multiple systems, filling in forms. They want to do research. And because ORCID is this interconnected hub in the research ecosystem, it enables data to be pulled out of the record. This is exactly the use case in Science CV, with the researcher's permission, so that they don't have to manually add that data. And the researcher can also give permission for data to automatically flow into their record from systems that they trust. So all of that leads to the reduction of administrative burden, and also portability of the profile data, because we're an open, community-driven system. At any time, anybody can connect and gain access to the data. Researchers can export their data should they so choose. So nobody's locked into any one particular proprietary system. Next slide. So we are very broadly used around the world. We did some analysis recently and figured out that we have researchers registered in 246 countries. If you use the ISO country code list. So that's everywhere apart from 3 really small island nations. And if anybody knows any researchers in those places, let us know, because we'd love to fill in those gaps in the map. Next slide. So, you know, obviously, because we want to be used so broadly, And because we're dealing with personal data of researchers, establishing the trust of the community has been absolutely key to get as far as we have and to get all of the participation that we've managed to achieve in our first decade. And there are really kind of two pillars to the way that we establish that trust. First of all, legal basis of ORCID, we're a US 501c3 nonprofit, which means, for example, no individual organization can financially benefit from our work. We couldn't be taken over by a commercial organization. Our bylaws and our constitution ensure that we're openly and fairly governed by our community. And also, we're very serious about taking privacy regulations seriously, especially in Europe, where there's some pretty tough legislation. But equally as important are our social principles and our public commitments to the community, which are embodied in our founding principles, our commitment to researcher control, which is absolute, that data only gets into an ORCID record or leaves an ORCID record if that's something the researcher chooses to happen, and they can remove data or even delete their record at any time. Our software is published open source. Our data is fair and open. We have a equitable business model where organizational members participate on an equal basis. And we're very serious about working transparently, working in public, and holding ourselves accountable to our community. Next slide, please, Shona. And this is my last slide, just to talk a little bit more about our model for researcher control. And essentially, researchers, once they go and register for that ORCID, have very fine-grained control over each individual element, for example, a publication or employment information. For every element in their profile, they can either make that available to everybody, public, which is the most useful, right? Obviously, the idea is that most of the data around an academic's career is public data, and most of our data is public because that's how researchers choose to share it. But they can also choose to restrict data that only they can see, for example, their email address. Maybe they don't want people to have access to that. And then also there's an option only to provide access to trusted parties, organizations who they've chosen to give access to their data. And with that, let me hand over to Shona, who's going to talk about how we participate in the broader research ecosystem.
Great, thanks, Chris. So stepping back and looking at the scholarly ecosystem, the researcher with their ORCID ID is at the center of it all. So on the right in red is the university that is connected to ORCID's registry and synced to auto-update information as it is published. So the arrows represent data that is being read and written to the researcher's ORCID profile. So on top in purple are the publishers who read from the author's ORCID profile to get information, like their affiliated university. So then at the time of publication, the publisher writes the article's citation to the researcher's ORCID profile. On the bottom in gold are the research funding agencies who also read and write to ORCID records. On the left in green are all the vendors of research profile management systems that we work with to connect these systems in order to move this data as smoothly as possible. So on average, ORCID data is read 117.5 million times per month by external systems, saving users time and reducing administrative burden. So considering these statistics and applying them to the data model at the center of the screen, you can see how the research ecosystem is driven and made more efficient by the real-time data that is made available by member organizations participating in the system. So universities have a critical role to play in the management of information about their researchers. And by connecting your various systems to ORCID's API, like your research management system, your student management system, annual report, tenure application review, and your HR systems, universities can write trustworthy and accurate data to your researcher's ORCID profile, which will then be reused when the researcher applies for funding or submits a manuscript to a publisher. So the more data that is written to ORCID profiles, the more useful they become to both your researchers and your institution. So ideally, universities write employment and education sections of ORCID profiles. So there are 3 ways universities can do this. So in the middle of the screen, you can see a snapshot of the employment section of an ORCID profile. So the example on the left, highlighted in green, was written by NYU using a research information management system. On the bottom, you can see the source of the data is listed as NYU, so the trustworthiness of this data is high. So the example on the right, highlighted in orange, was written by the researcher herself, and her name is reflected as the source of the data. So the example on the left requires a data management system and ORCID membership, while the orange example is free of charge. The third way to write data to ORCID records is featured on the bottom left, highlighted in purple. So this is the Affiliation Manager tool used by the University of Georgia in this example. So this tool is offered by ORCID to members of a consortium free of charge. All of the FDP members, all the FDP university members who have already joined ORCID, you have access to this tool and your staff can access it through ORCID's member portal. So ORCID has just started to deliver real-time reports to our consortium members. We appreciate Lori Schultz and the University of Arizona for allowing us to use their report as our example today. So the member affiliation report displays the details about your affiliated researchers over time. So you'll see a breakdown of the data your university has written to various sections of the ORCID profile, like the employment or education sections. So I've been speaking about universities so far, but it's important we take a moment to recognize the research funding agencies that are FDP members in the audience here today as well. So funders have a critical role to play in the management of their information about their affiliated researchers as well. By connecting your funding management systems to ORCID's API, funding agencies can write trustworthy and accurate data to researchers' ORCID profiles. This data will then be reused when the researcher applies for future funding or updates their data to their employer, like their annual reports. So speaking of systems you can use to write the ORCID profiles, universities often have a research information management system. Listed on the left in blue are the RIM systems commonly used by universities, and I thought you might like to know there are a few open source options available as well. So these systems can be used by administrators to write data to your researchers' ORCID profiles. So this will likely be a new responsibility for some of your university administrators, but it will significantly reduce the administrative burden of your researchers, and it will ensure research administrators have access to the information they need about their researchers without having to ask for it. So it's important to check and make sure your RIM system writes to the ORCID sections that you want it to write to. Some of the systems only write to the work section, while others write to them all. So feel free to reach out to ORCID and we can help you look into this. So now here's a list of funding management platforms that are used both by funding agencies and universities. All of these systems write to the funding section of ORCID profiles, as some of them will write to the other sections as well. So as Lori mentioned earlier, we're happy to say that ORCID meets the criteria listed in the recent NSPM 33 guidance, and we'd like to highlight 2 key points. So first, we allow researchers to create one profile to capture the full list of research-related affiliations and activities. We discourage researchers from creating multiple records, and we enable them to deprecate secondary IDs if they happen to be created. Second, we have worked hard over the past 10 years to connect ORCID to the systems of major publishers and funding agencies around the world, so they can both read and write data to the ORCID profiles of your researchers. So one such important connection is ORCID's current integration into ScienceCV for both the NIH and NSF. So this new guidance asks us to work closer together and to continue to optimize the data transfer between our 2 systems. We've identified a few minor gaps, and ORCID is committed to addressing them.
And Shauna, if you don't mind, I'd like to go back to ScienceCV for just a second.
Yeah.
And so many of the people in the audience will be familiar with ScienceCV and how it's integrated with the NIH and NSF's biosketches, and they're working right now on the NIH other support page, including the pieces that are required for certification of that information, which will be really interesting for this audience. And ScienceCV has been a really great proof of concept about how the data can flow from ORCID into a format that is necessary for the grant application process. And I think as we move forward, Science CV will be adapted to include that model form as we know what that format looks like. And there will be opportunities for the FDP community to provide usability testing there. So be on the lookout for those opportunities, because I think it will be very helpful for our community and getting a tool that we can all use really well. Thanks, Shauna.
No problem. That's wonderful. Thank you. That's great to hear. So Chris and I wanted to highlight a few of the significant systems that ORCID has integrated with over the years. And these are systems that drive the research ecosystem. So you can see some of the universities and publishers that have been writing to ORCID profiles. A new and interesting development is how funding agencies and research facilities are increasingly adopting ORCID to not only track which researchers receive their grants in award time, but they're also tracking the publications that resulted from the funded work by adopting other persistent identifiers for publications and grant IDs. So the reporting and impact assessment within the research ecosystem is improving. So 105 FDP universities are currently members of ORCID, and we thank you for your support. Chris is going to add a link into the chat to see if your university or agency is a member of ORCID. Please feel free to reach out to me as well. I'll share my email address at the end of the last slides. Most of the memberships were coordinated through your libraries. So if you're looking for an ORCID point of contact at your university or agency, the library is a great place to start. So the full list of US federal agencies that have joined ORCID are listed here. Most have joined ORCID through the ORCID Consortium for Federal Agencies. NOAA and USGS are finalizing their memberships as we speak, and we've received interest from a number of other agencies as well. So there certainly seems to be great momentum of ORCID adoption with the federal agencies. And we've also seen significant ORCID adoption by the user research facilities as well. Most, if not all, are integrating ORCID and other persistent identifiers into their research administrative systems. So if your organization is not an ORCID member yet, joining one of the two consortia is what your best value. US federal agencies can join the consortium hosted by DOE OSTI, while universities and nonprofit organizations can join LYRASIS ORCID Consortium. Both consortia are growing rapidly and have wonderful communities of practice. So we've covered a lot today so far, and I thought maybe it might be a good time just to pause and reflect on why we are doing all this work again. The research ecosystem, there's just so much data about researchers, their funding and their work, and it's genuinely hard to manage it all. We want to streamline the workflows, not only for researchers, but also for the research and funding administrators as well. So if the source of the data can write that data to the researcher's profile, then we can all reuse the original data, saving everyone time and effort. We just need to connect the systems, which will then make managing the researcher's disclosure requirements a whole lot easier. It's going to take everyone in the research ecosystem writing to the researcher's profile. Publishers to write the publication citation, funders writing the award information, and universities writing to the employment and education sections. The more we can write to the researcher's profile, the more useful it becomes, and we help streamline the workflow for everybody in the research ecosystem. So we've talked a lot about what everybody else in the research ecosystem is doing, but what about ORCID? What are we doing? So we're looking forward to coordinating the data listed in the NSPM 33 guidance document with the federal agencies. We're communicating with key stakeholders, raising awareness of this new expectation and how we can help organizations to meet their new requirements as easily as possible. And of course, our members and our communities of practice, we're actively speaking with them through events such as this, and the two ORCID consortia are keenly supporting their communities as well. So as research administrators, there's some steps your organizations can take to prepare for these changes. So first, identify who your organization is working with ORCID. Secondly, most of your organizations have a research information management system. It's best to check and make sure that it's connected to ORCID. And if your organization does not have a research information management system yet, it might be time to look into them and to make sure you pick one that writes to ORCID records. So here's my email address. As mentioned before, please feel free to reach out to me. It's no trouble at all. And I think we can turn it over to the audience for questions.
Thank you, Shauna and Chris. I know Pamela is working through the questions for us. You're on mute, Pamela.
Thank you. One question we received is just understanding a little bit better about what it takes for a university to support ORCID, like how much money it costs, what kind of effort it takes for an institution to actually be fully supportive of ORCID if they're not already doing that.
Sure. Do you want to take that one, Shauna?
Sure. So I think for a university, joining the Lyrasis ORCID Consortium, and I'll put a link in the chat to that group in a second, just after I finish. They're your best bet. There's over 170 members of that group right now. It's just a wonderful, really supportive group. And Pamela's university are one of the leaders. University of Minnesota is great. So the cost is $4,800 per year. And like, as I mentioned, there's 170 members, mostly universities, but there's some nonprofit funders as well. American Heart is one of the funders. So, and then once you join, we give you access to 5 keys to our API. So each system, you can have 5 of your systems connected to ORCID's member API. And if you want more keys, we can talk about that. You can buy more, it's no trouble. And then you just start connecting it to your different systems. So your research management system, your HR system. And I mentioned a lot of systems have ORCID connections built into them already, but if you have a system that doesn't, we can work with you and your developers to do a custom integration as well. So hopefully that's a good overview. Chris, would you add anything?
Just clarify that, of course, we appreciate the support of our university members, and we would encourage all of you to join, but that isn't required for your researchers to make use of ORCID. Anybody, like, free of charge, if an ORCID is useful to them, can make use of ORCID. So the main benefit that you get from being a member is, as Shauna said, you can hook up the systems that you're already using, and then start to contribute some of that data with researchers' permission to their ORCID records, which ultimately is going to save them time, so they don't have to enter it themselves, and also give you better insights by being able to know the ORCID IDs of your researchers, how they're contributing to scholarship, including, many of our members tell us after researchers move on to other institutions, they can kind of still track their total impact there through their career. So we'd love you all to become members, but don't feel that that's an obligation. Shauna will probably kick me for saying that, but
Thank you. We had also a question about AAMC's financial conflict of interest tool and how that works with ORCID.
Yeah, so we've talked. I think Convey is the system that you're talking about, and we've talked to them quite a lot. First of all, Convey is already integrated with ORCID in that it can collect ORCID IDs, and you can sign into Convey with ORCID. We kind of see these as 2 complementary pieces of the puzzle, in that the profile or the CV data that ORCID gathers is for the most part public, and the financial disclosure information that Convey for the most part manages tends to be only disclosed to specific organizations that are asking for it. So we think that we can work very collaboratively with Convey to address all of the needs that are in the NSPM 33 memo. That we don't see a need for us to have conflict of interest information, and I think similarly Convey doesn't see the need to add in a lot of kind of profile information. Anything to add, Shauna or Laurie, to that?
We have another question about from Corey about if there's a deadline date. We're research administrators, we go off at deadlines, right? So is there a date by which PIs will have to begin using a DPI or a PID?
Yeah, I'll start by saying, the guidance indicates that DPIs are to be recommended, not required. So I think really where we are as research administrators is the value of the DPI is in the data reuse that we've been talking about during this session, and the sort of non-value in the non-value in not having one is still having to generate those formats over and over again by rekeying that data for every application process. So there is a distinct difference in the level of work it will take once you have a DPI and your ORCID record set up. We're using ScienceDB to get through that, but they wouldn't be required, so there isn't really a deadline.
Okay, so, and that may somewhat relate to the next question that we have, and that is from Charlotte. That basically is talking about we have some subcontracts with community level collaborators. And of course, there's also foreign subcontracts as well. And with NIH's requirement that senior key personnel need to have an ERA Commons ID, then the question is, how will that be connected with the DPIs and work? Do we need to, as prime recipients, work with those individuals again to have ORCIDs established and linked up to the Commons ID?
Right. And I think, again, the DPI would not be required, but particularly in the context of NIH systems, ORCID links up particularly well with PubMed. So there is a lot of return benefit by linking your ORCID record with your ERA Commons ID. But in talking a little bit about, like subcontractors in particular, or entities that may not be in the higher ed space, from my perspective, is one of the reasons that the DPI will not be required globally of grantees, because those of us here are in higher ed institutions, academic medical centers, research organizations, where the scholarly output looks a lot the same. But many other grantee types, that is not true, and that could definitely be one of your subcontractors, where they don't have this history of academic publication or other things that are the footprint of academic output. So it wouldn't necessarily make sense in their work life to have something like an ORCID.
Thank you. So Maria is asking, when an ORCID record is already linked with a university, is it possible for the university to populate information for the investigator that the investigator then in turn can modify?
Yeah, absolutely. So we encourage institutions to do that, because if you're already holding information, whether it's about you do obviously hold information about education and employment with your institution, but we know many universities in their RIM systems hold publication information, award information, etc. So the model is that you can essentially invite your researchers to allow you to update their records. They always have to grant permission, but once they've done that, any information that you hold can automatically flow through to the ORCID record. The researcher again is always in control, so any information they don't want on their profile, they can remove, they can revoke that permission at any time. They can't edit the information, because as you might have noticed in one of Shauna's slides, we preserve the source of the information. Mm-hmm. So if information is being contributed from a RIM system, we want that to be the data that's in the RIM system. But researchers can always remove that entry and add a modified version that would be attributed to them as the source.
Okay, thank you. So Lori, I'll give you this one. We have a question about whether ORCID is the only entity issuing or maintaining DPIs.
Yeah, and I'll ask Chris and Shauna to weigh in as well. No, but then DPIs are not just for people. So, as research administrators, we're not often exposed to the publishing life cycle of our researchers. We help them with applications and grant processing and expenditure allowability and those sorts of things. And the only time we ever care about page charges is getting them in before the grant ends. Like, that's when we know about publications happening as research administrators. But the whole universe of DPIs includes persistent identifiers for things like data sets and publications. Those are called digital object identifiers. And there are other kinds of PIDs or DPIs for research organizations and research sources. We could probably do a whole other hour on the kinds of DPIs that there are out there. But ORCID is the only provider of DPIs for individuals that meets the requirements in the NSPM 33 guidance.
Thank you.
And I would add, for full disclosure, there are other providers of DPIs for people. There are a number of proprietary systems, Researcher ID, Scopus ID. There are also kind of library authority file systems where libraries assign individuals, but as Laurie mentioned, none of those, as far as we're aware, meet all of the criteria defined in the OSTP guidance.
Yeah, and that's typically because they're not open and controlled by the researcher. That's usually the big reason.
Yeah.
Thank you. So Victor wants to know if DPIs can help in tracking faculty commitments on multiple grants.
Shauna, do you want to have a go at that one?
Anybody want to take that one?
Is would that be the commitment hours committed?
Yeah, this is the person months conversation.
Effort.
Remember that little gap I mentioned? There's two little gaps we've identified, and so that's one of them. And so we work internationally with funding agencies and government policy agencies around the world. I have a feeling that that's going to be a common request amongst several governments and funding agencies. I'm not sure about the units, how to measure time committed. I think that might be an interesting conversation. So I am ready for that conversation and how we're going to proceed with it, but it hasn't started yet. So, but yes, we're ready for that.
I would add that, it's not our goal at ORCID to hold all of the metadata, right? The detailed metadata about a grant award should belong in a grant management system. The key thing that we can help with is the link between the person and the grants they've been awarded, so that you can establish that relationship and go and consume that more detailed metadata from that system. And that's the same with publications. We have the basic bibliographic metadata about publications, but if you want the detailed authoritative metadata, you can use the DOI, the other kind of identifier that Laurie mentioned, to go and get the authoritative metadata about that object. And essentially that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to link up all of these different metadata sources in a coherent way.
There's also a question about NSF's adoption of ORCID, and maybe if you could say a bit more about that.
So we have been speaking to NSF, and they're not technically ORCID members yet, although we're very much looking forward to that. Of course, they do use the ORCID ID for sign-in to Science CV and to help populate the Science CV. So that's a free service. It's just once members want to start writing to ORCID records, then membership is required. And so I think everyone's looking forward to NSF writing to ORCID records to help really drive that interoperability and to streamline workflows. So my answer is hopefully soon. We're looking forward to the NSF membership and integrations.
Okay. Megan wants to know if you could share any updates about headway that's been made around new integrations with research management systems that perhaps are not yet set up with integrations.
Sure, maybe I'll tackle that one. And first, let us know if your favorite research information management system is not hooked up with ORCID. One of the things we were busy with last year, and you saw some of those slides in the presentation, was really clearly articulating the value that we offer to our various stakeholder groups. So you saw, I talked a little bit about the value that we offer to researchers. Shauna talked about the value that we offer to universities and to funders. We've also been thinking about the value that we offer to vendors, because I think that's not necessarily been 100% clear to them in the past. And one of the things we have, what we call a certified service provider program, essentially a list of vendors that are pre-integrated with ORCID that meet our criteria. One of the things we're going to be working with working on this year is revamping that program and essentially to give vendors stronger incentives and to clarify the benefits to them of integrating with ORCID, because obviously, a lot of these are commercial organizations and they're only going to do things that ultimately are in their own self-interests. Although, of course, hearing from you as their customers always helps.
Okay. I just want to, go ahead, please.
Sorry, I was just going to quickly mention, I put a link into the chat it's a chart we have on our website of the ORCID-enabled systems, and we have the different system types, our research management system, the funding, the publishers. One group that we haven't broken into yet, but we're really excited to, are the student management systems. And if you want to, introduce us to your rep and help get an ORCID integration to your student management system, please let me know. And I'm just about to put a link in for the ORCID certified systems that Chris mentioned as well for your reference.
That's so helpful, Shanna. Thank you. So we also received, for those of you looking at the questions, a helpful link from Sheila about the Lyrasis membership and how to get in any nonprofit organization, as Shanna said, can join the ORCID US Community Consortium. And so the link to that is right in the Q&A if anyone is interested. So.
Yeah, and I would add also that there is a link from Rebecca Bryant in the Q&A of a report from the OCLC about research information management systems in the US, which is a really great overview of what they are, how they work, and sort of would really get this community up to speed if you're not already familiar with those systems.
Great. Well, Stephanie is hoping that you all will talk a bit more about RIMs. It looks like these are systems our libraries are more familiar with, but for those of us that are mere mortals, can you tell us what an example is of a RIM?
Chris, you want me to take this one and then? Okay.
Sure.
So RIM, Research Information Management Systems, and in Europe, they're referred to as CRIS systems, CRIS, Current Research Information Systems. So when you're Googling, use both and you'll get some results. But the systems that I listed are some of the more common systems that are used. So Elsevier Pure is probably the most fulsome system. And Lori at University of Arizona, you've just adopted Pure, so you're setting that up yourself right now. At my last university, I set up Symplectic Elements was another one. Ex Libris Esploro. So Ex Libris does tend to be more of a library vendor, but they're becoming very interested in the research administrators. They quite like you guys now. And so they have a platform called Esploro that's just been connected with ORCID as well. So really they're kind of like inventory management systems of your researchers, who you have, you collect all their ORCID IDs, you can use those systems to write. You don't have to be a developer. Administrators can do that work. So that makes your life a lot easier. Chris or Lori, would you add anything?
The only thing I'd add is those systems may or may not be connected with what your institution uses for faculty activity reporting or promotion and tenure dossiers. So that's another place that they link up.
Okay, great. Well, Dustin wants to know about writing data the other direction. So he knows that applications can write data into ORCID, but can ORCID write data out into other applications, perhaps via APIs?
Sure. So it's more of a pull model, in that, as I mentioned, we have 3 levels of privacy control: private, public, and trusted. And we actually have an open API that supports millions of requests a day, where thousands of systems pull data from the public ORCID API, and member organizations can use the member API that also lets you get at that trusted data, which is a relatively small amount. But yeah, thousands of systems every day are reusing that ORCID data, which is the whole point, right? Because that's what saves the researchers the burden and the overhead of typing it in again in a different format. We have lots of, if you're running a system you'd like to hook up to ORCID, we have lots and lots of documentation on our website.
Okay. Great. So, well, Anna wants to know about what kind of training will be available as ORCID integrates with Science CV and biosketches in general. Whether ORCID would provide that training, I guess we can ask the question, can FDP offer that training as well?
And I think for Science CV in particular, FDP is well placed with the working group that developed Science CV and is working on like the testing opportunities I mentioned earlier because the Science CV team does make YouTube videos for training and things like that. But I think we can work with them to ensure that folks understand how to use it, especially as we expect it to be used so much more with this new model form when it becomes available and becomes required during the application process.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I'd say that, as Shauna mentioned, most universities, research institutions in the US join ORCID through the Lyrasis US ORCID community. And one of the amazing things Lyrasis does, and I see Sheila and I'm sure that other people from Lyrasis on the call, is really help develop that community of practice in the US and exchange best practices, run a great series of regular webinars. So a huge benefit of joining ORCID through Lyrasis is you get access to all of that great material and all that great support.
Well, obviously one topic that we're all super concerned with these days are hacking and digital and cyber attacks. So we have a question about how ORCID's prepared to prevent or counter digital attacks.
Yeah, so and one of the things we need to think about is, what modes of attack might we be subject to? Obviously we take all of the usual precautions around information security, IT security with controls over access levels, firewalls, penetration testing, regular patches, all of those list of things you have to do, which of course is, I think for all of us, never increasing area of attention. I think a related area for ORCID that we think about a lot is not necessarily cyber attacks, but the addition of fraudulent claims to ORCID records. And our model there is really we have a dispute resolution process where anybody can raise a dispute around a piece of data in an ORCID record. Again, most of it's public, but they don't believe to be true. And then we will follow up with the record holder and ask them to substantiate that information is indeed correct. And if, in most cases, mistakes are made and researchers are happy to adjust that data, if they don't, then ultimately we will lock the record, which essentially means making it inaccessible until the dispute is resolved.
Okay, thank you. I know we're almost out of time, so I'm going to do one last question. There's a thoughtful question in here from Virginia about asking if you feel if there are any roadblocks for a full adoption or usage of ORCIDs and therefore gaining the full value of the ORCID platform. And really, what's the ideal state from the researcher's point of view?
I think if you ask researchers, they very much appreciate the fact that they're fully in control of ORCID, that nobody's making the information available without their permission, and that they can remove it at any time they want to. But ideally, they prefer not to have to enter it in the first place, right? And we're already in a very good position with publications. We work with a fellow DPI provider for publications called Crossref. So thousands of publishers automatically flow their publication data into ORCID. We'd love to see that also happen for employment and educational data. And that's where we rely on the research institutions, because you're the holders of authoritative holders of that data. So we'd really like to encourage more research institutions to add their educational credentials, employment data to ORCID. And similarly for funders, and this is early days, a handful of funders are starting to do that. We'd really love them to start adding their funding award information to data. All of that can be added manually by the researcher, but it both saves them time and it's also more trustworthy if the authoritative source of that data is adding it directly to the records.
Thank you, Chris. Well, I want to, on behalf of FDP, Michelle, Alex, Jim, and Lori, thank all of you. Lori, I want to thank you both directions, right? As a master organizer and knowledge expert for us on this, and both of you as well, to just your incredible insights into this topic, which is new for many of us. And giving us this basic and solid grounding on what DPIs are and how they get used gives us the tools we need to actually start or expand our knowledge in terms of how we can actually make all this real and helpful for our researchers. So thank you all so much for doing this for us. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks so much, everybody.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. So,
Bye-bye.
bye.